Okay, this week's parsha, Parshas Vayishlach. We're going to talk a little bit about faith. We need to have faith. Yaakov returns to Eretz Yisrael, and he receives a report that his brother Esav is coming to greet him with 400 apparently armed men. So that leads Yaakov to the conclusion that Esav's intentions are not friendly. So the verse says, Vayira Yaakov ma'od, that Yaakov was very, very scared. So he took precautions. And if you learn the verses carefully, you'll see that he prepared himself in three ways. First, he prepared himself for the eventuality of war. He divided his camp into two, so that if one half would be attacked, the other half would have time to escape. So that's preparation for war. He didn't prepare to engage in battle. He knew that he could not battle 400 armed men, but he prepared for the eventuality of battle. In other words, by dividing the camp to give at least half the time to escape. He didn't know which side Esav would attack from, but at least half of his entourage would survive. Then he prepared by sending tribute to Esav. And the Torah describes the magnificent gift that he sent in order to bribe Esav, to win Esav over, to appease Esav. And finally he prepared himself with prayer. And the Torah records the prayer that he said on this occasion, that God should help him from Esav. Chazal are bothered. We know in last week's parsha, Parshas Vayetze, as Yaakov was leaving Eretz Yisrael, God made a promise to him that he would protect him, that he would help him. So Yaakov is the beneficiary of a divine promise. So what's he scared about? Nothing to fear. God made a promise. God is good to keep his word. So why should Yaakov be scared? I'll mention that I once heard a thought. It says in the verse, Vayira Yaakov ma'od, Yaakov was very scared, Vayetzer, and he was distressed. So I once heard a Hasidic interpretation that he was very scared, and he was very distressed that he was scared, because he really was unjustified. Because if he had this divine promise, then he shouldn't have been scared, but he was scared, so that disturbed him. Why should he be scared in light of the fact that he was the beneficiary of the promise? Chazal and the Talmud don't understand it this way. Chazal say the reason Yaakov was scared is Shema Yigrom Hachet, that maybe his sin or sins may cause that the promise should not be operative. And the Talmud records other instances of such fears. Now what it means is this, that when God makes a promise, there is an implicit condition. There's a string attached. I'm making the promise to you as you are today, but if you subsequently sin, then the promise isn't operative. So therefore, Yaakov was scared because he thought, it's true, God made a promise. Actually, by now it's already 20 years ago. But perhaps in the interim he had sinned, and therefore the promise would not be in force. That's what the Talmud says. Shema Yigrom Hachet. Now the Talmud doesn't say what that sin might have been. Like what sin is it possible that Yaakov committed? Now again, 20 years is a long time. But what is the specific sin that Yaakov may have committed that would have resulted in the promise not being operative? The Gemara doesn't say, the Talmud doesn't say. The Ramban offers a conjecture. The Ramban's conjecture is that the sin is the sin that took place in the end of last week's parsha, which is that Yaakov made a covenant with Lavan. As you may remember, Lavan was chasing after Yaakov. Finally they caught up. There were words shared, but in the end they made a bris, they made a covenant. And that might have been sinful. Why is that sinful? Because when you make a covenant with an idolater, that implies an acceptance, it implies an approval of that person's values. You're treating him as an equal, and that might have been a sin for Yaakov Avinu to make such a covenant. As we know that ultimately when the Torah was given, there is a mitzvah in the Torah, a prohibition actually, that the Jewish people are not allowed to make a covenant with a foreign nation allowing them to practice idolatry. Because any covenant which allows the Gentiles to practice idolatry is prohibited, because the very covenant implies acceptance and acquiescence, and a Jew cannot acquiesce to idolatry. It's not only forbidden for him to practice idolatry, he can't make an agreement that allows someone else to practice idolatry. So perhaps that was the sin, but that's a conjecture. This much the Talmud says. Yaakov was scared that the promise was not operative because of a sin. Elsewhere, the Talmud says something else, and if you are sensitive to the nuances of the Talmudic terminology, you'll see that these two statements in the Talmud are not saying the same thing. In Yaakov's prayer, he says the words katonti, I have been diminished, mikol hachasodim and mikol ha'emes, from all of the kindnesses that you performed with your servant. Because God did many kindnesses for Yaakov, and Yaakov says, I am diminished, I am reduced because of the kindnesses you did. Now what does it mean, I am reduced, I am diminished? So the Talmud says a very interesting thing. The Talmud says like this, that a person should never put himself in a dangerous situation, the Talmud says, as a rule. Don't do anything reckless. Don't put yourself in a dangerous situation. Why? Because maybe you will not merit miraculous salvation. You'll put yourself in a situation where you need a miracle to be saved, and you won't deserve a miracle. So don't put yourself in that situation. And even if God will perform the miracle, maybe that will result in your merits being exhausted. You know, not everybody has a bank account. You do mitzvahs, you do good deeds, you're making deposits. If God has to perform a miracle on your behalf, that's a withdrawal. So you have to make sure that you're not overdrawn. So that's what the Talmud says. You have to be very careful that if you put yourself in a situation that you'll need a miracle, so first of all, God may not perform the miracle. And even if He does, it may reduce your merits. It'll be withdrawn from your account. Where do you see this concept? From the prayer of Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu said, I'm praying to you to help me because I am scared that my merits have been diminished. I've exhausted my merits. Meaning all the kindnesses, all the miracles you've already performed for me have reduced my merits, and now I'm overdrawn, or at zero. I have no available balance, and therefore I'm scared of Esav. Now this is not the exact same thing as the Talmud said in the first statement. Here the Talmud isn't saying that Yaakov is scared that he committed a sin. It says Yaakov is scared that his merits have been exhausted. He's used up his merits. Now again, if you're sensitive to the nuance of the terminology, it seems we're doing two different things. In one place, the Talmud says, is that what Yaakov Avinu was scared of is perhaps he had committed a sin. In the other place, it says what he was scared of is perhaps he had exhausted his merit. So are these the same thing? Are these different things? Because Rashi, interestingly, combines them. When Rashi explains the words katonti, he says like this. He says, Nismatu zchuyosai, my merits have been reduced, al yedei achasodim shasisi imi, because of the kindnesses you did, and lekach ani yorei, and that's why I'm scared. Because Shema mishiftachtanim nislachlachti bechet. Maybe after you made the promises to me, I became dirtied with sin. So Rashi lumps the two together, inexplicably. But it seems we're really dealing with two different issues. I'd like to explain what I think the issue here is. As we know, a very fundamental aspect of Judaism is the belief in reward and punishment. In Hebrew it's called schar v'onesh, reward and punishment. That every good deed is rewarded, every sin is punished. Where the reward takes place, where the punishment takes place, that's really a detail. Sometimes it's in this world, sometimes it's in the next world. Sometimes the reward is in one area, sometimes in another area. Likewise with the punishment. How exactly the rewards and punishments are delivered, that's really beyond our understanding. But this fundamental principle we accept, that there is reward and punishment. Every good deed is rewarded, every aveira, every sin is punished. Once a mitzvah is rewarded, you're not going to be rewarded for the same mitzvah. Because once you've gotten paid for your work, you don't get paid a second time. So what if the payment for your good deeds is that God helped you out of a real bind, because you were in real trouble, and God helped you. And that was the reward for your mitzvah. So that's it. The merit is exhausted. You're not going to be rewarded a second time for the same mitzvah. And that seems to be the idea of katonti, that I've been diminished by all the kindnesses you've already done. Because Yaakov is saying like this, look, I know that I've done many good deeds. I mean, Yaakov wasn't fooling himself. Yaakov knew he was a tzaddik. He knew that over the years he had done many mitzvahs, many good deeds. But he felt that he had already been paid for them. All the kindnesses, all the help he had in the house of Lavan, which we read in last week's parasha, that at every juncture Lavan tried to hurt him and HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped him. So he felt he already was paid. So now he's in trouble again. Now the trouble is with Esav. So he says like this, if my merits would still be intact, if they wouldn't have been exhausted, then perhaps I could have relied on that merit to be spared from Esav. But Katonte, I've been diminished. I've used it up. I've been paid already. So once I'm paid, I can't demand payment a second time. So that's why I'm in trouble. That's why I'm begging for mercy. That's the first argument, that my merits have been diminished. I've used them up already. They've been exhausted. All the chasadim, all the kindnesses, all the favors, all the miracles you've already done as a payment for my mitzvahs. So I've received my payment. So now I'm not entitled to any further payment. And therefore, I can't count on you helping me in this instance as a payment for my mitzvahs, and that's why I'm scared. That's one point. But there's something else you have to know. That aside from the aspect of reward, which is a payment for my good work, there's an idea that the Rambam tells us in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, that there's a concept of hashgacha pratis. Hashgacha pratis means divine providence, divine protection. And who does God give this protection to? Is it given to all people equally? And the Rambam tells us something very interesting. He says that the level of divine protection a person has in this world is a function of his spiritual level. Because when a person does mitzvahs, it isn't just that he earns reward. When a person does mitzvahs, he studies Torah, he davens, he does good things, he elevates himself to a higher spiritual plane. And the higher plane you are on, the higher level you are on, the more you are able to enjoy this divine protection. And it's not so much a payment for your mitzvahs. It's rather the idea that your spiritual level motivates God to provide you the extra protection. Because you are more beloved to Him, you are more precious to Him, you're more valuable to Him. And therefore He gives you the extra protection, not as a payment for your mitzvahs, but simply because you are on that higher spiritual plane. It would seem to me that in this element, in this aspect, it really is irrelevant how many times God has already helped you. When we're speaking about payment, when we're speaking about reward for the mitzvahs, the payment for the mitzvahs, so correct, once you've been paid once, you're not going to be paid a second time. But if we're speaking about a person's spiritual stature, a person's spiritual stature is not diminished by the fact that he already has been rewarded for his mitzvahs. And if you're a tzaddik gomer, you're an absolute tzaddik, no averas, a lot of mitzvahs, so you're on a very high spiritual plane. You're not going to say that just because God has already awarded you for your mitzvahs, now you're a Rosh, now you're a wicked person. You're not a wicked person. You're just as much of a tzaddik as you were before. It's just that you've been paid for the mitzvahs. But if the divine protection is not just given as a reward for mitzvahs, it's also given because of your spiritual stature, then Yaakov can count on something too. Yaakov can say, yes, it's true. I've been already paid for my mitzvahs. But my spiritual stature isn't diminished. My spiritual bank account may be diminished. My deposits may be diminished. But the reality of my spiritual stature is still intact. And if God provides protection because of that, I can count on that too. So here Yaakov was scared of something else. Yaakov was scared that maybe his spiritual stature was also diminished. Maybe he did a chet. Maybe he did an aveir. And as Rashi puts it, Shema nislach lachti b'chet. Maybe I dirtied myself with chet. Maybe my spiritual stature has been ruined, blemished by sins that I may have performed. In which case, I'm not deserving on either count. I'm not deserving of divine protection as a reward for my mitzvahs because I've already exhausted the reward. Because God already has paid me tenfold with the miracles He's already done on my behalf. I'm not deserving of divine protection because of my spiritual stature, because perhaps I've ruined that with a sin. And therefore, both of these ideas are necessary. But he's only scared because of the two together. Because there are two reasons why he would have been able to count on God. Either because of the reward for his mitzvahs, or because of the divine protection which is given because of his great stature. And therefore he was scared. The mitzvahs could have been exhausted. The stature could have been diminished because of the blemish of sin. And therefore he's scared. The promise is not operative. The promise is not operative. Now let me tell you an interesting thing. Based on the Talmud, if I were to ask the following question, so is Yaakov justified in having been scared? You'd say, yeah, he had very good reason of being scared. He was totally justified. His merits were exhausted. His spiritual stature may have been blemished by sin. So he had all the reason in the world to be scared. Now, there's a very curious statement Maimonides makes, the Rambam makes. The Rambam wrote a famous work called the Shmoina Prakim. The 8 chapters. This is the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos. And in it, in the 7th chapter, he makes a statement. He says that even the greatest prophets of the Jewish people, who had attained very lofty spiritual levels, also had flaws. They weren't perfect. To become a Navi, to become a prophet, to receive the divine presence, requires a relative level of perfection, but not an absolute level of perfection. And he goes on and discusses each of the biblical prophets and shows that each of them had a character flaw. None of them was perfect. And that's the lesson. The lesson is that, yes, you have to be relatively good, but there's no requirement of absolute perfection. And it goes through David HaMelech, what his flaw is, and what this one's flaw was, and so on and so forth. When he comes to Yaakov Avinu, he says Yaakov Avinu's flaw was a lack of trust in God. He was scared. And that's a flaw, because a Jew is supposed to have trust in God. Yaakov lacked this trust, therefore he was scared. And this is a flaw. And from here you see that a person could be a prophet despite the fact he has a flaw. You know, the commentators ask that this Rambam is inexplicable. The Talmud explains why Yaakov was justified. For the reasons we explained. He was justified because his merits were exhausted. Perhaps he committed a sin, and that diminished his spiritual level. So the Talmud says that he was totally justified in his fear. So how can the Rambam come and say that no, this is a flaw of character, and it proves that a prophet doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, only relatively perfect. He can have imperfections. What's the proof? The Talmud says that Yaakov was totally justified. So Rabbi Eliezer Wasserman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, writes in an essay the following. there really are two issues over here. There's one issue that the Talmud deals with, which is that Yaakov Avinu was the beneficiary of a divine promise. So why was he scared? There's a divine promise. So the Talmud on that gives the answers. That there's an implicit condition, either that his merits not be reduced, or that his spiritual stature not be reduced. And therefore Yaakov was justified in not counting on the divine promise. But there's another issue entirely. There is an obligation, every Jew, even if he is not the beneficiary of a divine promise, there's an obligation to put one's trust in God.
So he has an obligation to?
Put one's trust in God. This is called bitachon. Bitachon is placing one's trust in God. And that's not only for people who have divine promises. This is even for people who have never spoken to God. God never spoke to them. There is a mitzvah of bitachon. There is a mitzvah to place your trust in God. And the Ramban writes, the Ramban wrote a little sefer, a little book on this subject, called Emunah Bitachon, belief and trust. And he says, even an absolutely wicked person is obligated to place his trust in God and is justified in doing so and can count on God's help. Now, how can that be? An absolutely wicked person. So the Ramban says like this. I'll bring it out with an illustration. Let's say a person needs a favor. And it comes to your attention that this person needs a certain favor. So you ask yourself, is he deserving of my effort? Is he not deserving? Should I help him? Shouldn't I help him? You may decide, no, I'm not going to help him. He's not deserving of my attention. But let's say the person comes over to you and says, listen, I'm in trouble. I need help. I'm counting on you. Because you're the only person that can help me. I have no one else to turn to. What are you going to say then?